I'm Dr. Eugenia Gold, and welcome to a very special episode of Science on the Street. I've collected 6 paleontologists to have a Jurassic conversation today, covering all of your questions about Jurassic Park and the Jurassic World franchise. So just to introduce everybody off the bat, we have Victoria Arbour, Curator of Paleontology at the Royal British Columbia Museum in British Columbia, Canada. Victoria, please tell me your favorite prehistoric animal portrayed in the Jurassic franchise.
Okay, I'm going to say something that may surprise some of the members of this group here, but it is not the Ankylosaurus. My favorite one is actually Dilophosaurus from the original series.
I was not expecting that, for sure. Next, we have Riley Black, author of The Last Days of the Dinosaurs and My Beloved Brontosaurus and other books. Same question, Riley.
Oh, we're definitely an Allosaurus household, so I'll say Allosaurus, specifically the one from Battle at Big Rock. I loved how gnarly it looked.
Nice. Kimi Chapelle, postdoctoral researcher in the Division of Paleontology at the American Museum of Natural History. Same question.
So more recently, I guess in the new movie, I'd have to say the Dicynodon, the little Lystrosaurus, because South Africa.
Fair enough. Ashley Hall, Outreach Program Manager at the Museum of the Rockies. Same question.
Parasaurolophus for sure. In the most recent film, it was beautiful and so majestic and just, it was depicted perfectly, I thought. So Parasaurolophus for sure.
Next, we have Thomas Holtz, Principal Lecturer in Vertebrate Paleontology in the Department of Geology at the University of Maryland. Same question.
Totally going to surprise people on this. The savior of the heroes in multiple movies, the one who gets it almost every movie so far, Tyrannosaurus Rex, and specifically Rexy herself. So,
yeah, not coming as a surprise to anyone who knows you. And finally, we have Evan Johnson-Ransom, an incoming PhD student at the University of Chicago, who's currently at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, looking at feeding behavior in theropods. Same question, Evan.
Yeah, so normally I would be inclined to say T-Rex ever, but in a recent film, there was one prehistoric animal that did something very heroic, and that was the Dicynodon. It bit a bad guy's hand, and I'm like, that must have really hurt. You would not want to be interested in a dose shot first.
So my first question is for Ashley and Victoria specifically. How do you feel the Jurassic franchise has affected interest in paleontology through your outreach programs and your museum programs?
Victoria, you want to take it first?
Sure, I can go first. Yeah, I think, Jurassic Park has just been this like juggernaut of a paleo phenomenon since it came out. And I'll also say that I was of the like peak age to be like super into the original Jurassic Park because I'm in my late 30s now. So yeah, and it's just been a real fixture in a lot of the programs I do. People always want to know about is what was shown in Jurassic Park real, right? And so I always get questions about, could T-Rex run that fast? Could a Spinosaurus beat a T-Rex in a fight? All kinds of questions like that. And I think that Jurassic Park has been a really great springboard for talking about what we know about dinosaurs and how we know it. So I really embrace it. I really like talking about Jurassic Park. I'm talking about it today, which is great. And yeah, it's like a constant fixture in all of the public perception of dinosaurs.
And echoing off Victoria, same thing here. I remember coming out of the movie theater opening weekend at 9 years old and being like just knowing that my life had been changed forever. And I'll never forget that feeling. And I can still like go back to that feeling. And then ever since then, I've just been on this like mission-driven goal to make it my business to just educate everyone about dinosaurs. And so I'm doing that, but then the kids these days are coming into the Museum of the Rockies, which, by the way, has the biggest collection of T-Rex and Triceratops in the whole world. And guess what they ask about? Do you have Indominus Rex? So there's all sorts of, references that come up with kids these days because I handle our field trips. And what I see is kids are still excited about T-Rex and Triceratops, but they are really engaged by these new creatures as well that have been introduced, like Mosasaurus, And so even though that's not a dinosaur, it's become a fast fan favorite. So it's definitely, we're seeing it in the education realm in museums for sure.
So I know we covered this a little bit, but how does that make you feel when you ask someone what their favorite dinosaur is and they come at you with Mosasaurus or, Pteranodon or something completely made up like Indominus?
Honestly, it's an educational opportunity. So, when we answer that question, I say, oh, well, actually, those aren't dinosaurs, but those are cousins of dinosaurs, and they're just really cool. So I always take it as an educational opportunity.
Same question to Riley. How do you feel when people say Indominus is their favorite?
I mean, technically it's a dinosaur. You can certainly pick Indominus if you want to. But I agree with Ashley in that, it is an educational moment. And the thing that I've found, whatever it is, it's not just Jurassic Park, but, people get so fascinated about dinosaurs and what they do and how they lived and have their own ideas about them. And sometimes those ideas don't track with what we know from the fossil record or from the science. But I feel like it's very important to validate where these people are coming from, that they're coming to us with enthusiasm, and to rather than give them a kind of lecture about this animal. They're oh yeah, that is super cool. It might not be a dinosaur, but we've learned all this neat stuff about it. So I feel like it's definitely a starting point for conversations, as long as the person seems receptive to that information and it isn't well, I'm going to go find a Dominus Rex. It's okay, you go do that, and then we'll talk.
Next question for Holtz and for Evan. Holtz, why don't you take the first shot at this one? There's a lot of, and you mentioned this actually in your intro, there's a lot of Tyrannosaurus verse in the Jurassic franchise. So we see Tyrannosaurus versus Velociraptor in Jurassic Park, versus Spinosaurus in Jurassic Park 3, versus Giganosaurus in Dominion. Would these creatures have ever interacted with each other? What's sort of the pattern of large-scale theropod dominance that we see in the Mesozoic?
Sure. So in the specific case of Tyrannosaurus itself, it lived at a sort of unusual point in time and space in dinosaur history, in that it was alone in terms of being a great big huge carnivore. You roll the history of the Earth back to the late Jurassic, and you could be in an environment where you've got two equally large but anatomically very different creatures, Torvosaurus and Allosaurus, in the same community, and Ceratosaurus snidely and looking off to the side, waiting to pick off whoever's wounded. That wasn't the case for the age of Tyrannosaurus. So the meat-eating dinosaur to which an adult Tyrannosaurus would have been most in danger of was another adult Tyrannosaurus, and that we very much have evidence that kind of thing happens. There's a lot of pathologies that have been found on not just Tyrannosaurus, but most of the large carnivorous dinosaurs that showed non-lethal contact with another member of their own species or something very similar. So they did, at least on times, engage in fights among giant dinosaurs, which of course is something that appeals to a lot of people, at least in terms of Hollywood. And I think also in just picturing wildlife, there is this thread throughout the history of portraying wildlife, of showing the wild life of animals fighting, although that would be something they only did a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the time. So that said, in an artificial world like Jurassic World or Jurassic Park, if you introduced a big Tyrannosaurus and a big Giganotosaurus or Spinosaurus into the same environment, I'm sure there would be occasions where they might come to blows. It's not a guarantee that, Tyrannosaurus would have been the victor. I think more often than not, it probably would have been, for various reasons we could talk about later on. But other large creatures could certainly have been a threat to it.
None of those reasons surely are your own personal bias for Tyrannosaurus, right, Holtz?
No, it's hard, objective science.
Evan, do you have anything to add to that wonderful description?
Yes, I can definitely add to that one. One of the things that I can definitely say is that when I study the feeding behavior of other theropod dinosaurs is that if you are a T-Rex or maybe another Tyrannosaur, specifically a large Tyrannosaur, you are able to shrug off very high stress when biting, however. And in doing so, you're actually able to exhibit a very high bite force. Now, when we take a look at other theropods like Giganotosaurus, Spinosaurus, and Allosaurus, they, however, are exhibiting very high cranial stress when biting, or in this case, subjected to very high forces. But one of the things I do like is that non-Tyrannosaur theropods are able to have their own unique adaptations, though. This includes studying the skull morphology and teeth. And I think the one thing that Jurassic World Dominion did better than Jurassic Park 3 is that they actually showed a scuffle between T-Rex and Giganotosaurus, where it's just a scuffle. It's not a big belted diff, compared to Jurassic Park 3, where the T-Rex chases Dr. Alan Grant and co after eating a good Parasaurolophus and fights Spinosaurus, though. It's like, hey, you're in my turf, leave. And it's like, okay, I also just go chase you then. Oh, Spinosaurus, I gotta fight him, though.
I think, yeah, a lot of these big shows to the public show apex predators fighting to the death a lot of the time, when really in nature we don't see that a lot. No one really wants to be injured. So I think it's more of a show of force. All right, Evan, a follow-up question for you. Is a goat too small of a meal for T-Rex?
So it depends, however. It depends because it's kind of like a goat would actually be more like a snack, however. A full 6 foot tall adult would probably be enough to satiate a T-Rex, however, too. In fact, I think there was a study that analyzed how much mass T-Rex would probably need to eat, however. And I think both the goat was just more like an appetizer, but then I guess it was still hungry, so it felt like, I guess just eat this lawyer right now then. So it's one of those moments where it's kind of like T-Rex has to eat, and it also does bring into ideas about whether dinosaurs were warm-blooded or cold-blooded. So if it's cold-blooded, it won't have to really eat as much. But if it's warm-blooded, then it will have to eat a copious amount of food. But I think having a goat would just not cut it.
So moving away from theropods for a little bit, Kimi. We see Brachiosaurus in Jurassic Park and we see Dreadnoughtus in Jurassic World, mostly just walking around, getting their bodies out of the water. What is one aspect of sauropod biology that you would have wanted to see portrayed?
Well, okay, I'm also a bit biased on this because of my research. But I mean, if there's one thing that's amazing about not just sauropods, but also earlier branching sauropodomorphs, is the amount of eggs and embryos that we have for them as a clade. And I think that would have been just really great. Like, for example, we know that the early branching ones have like nest fidelity. So, you know, it would have just been like a really cool thing to sort of show. Not just the nest, but, you know, also the juveniles, or, you know, show some of them hatching, or there's hypothesized egg teeth maybe in some of the later derived sauropods. So I don't know, all of these things that have sort of come out in the research in the past sort of decade would have been very cool to see.
Awesome. Victoria, continuing with our moving away from theropods, we are sort of a theropod-centric group here. This is a serious question coming from my husband. Why are ankylosaurs so awesome?
A fine question. My favorite question. Ankylosaurs are awesome because they have an internal skeleton like we do, and they also have an exoskeleton, which is kind of weird for us. We don't really have anything like that on our body. So ankylosaurs are covered in these osteoderms, which means skin bone, which is really gross when you translate that out. And they sit in sort of the dermal layer of the skin. That's where they grow and form, and that gives them that really awesome spiky appearance. And then those osteoderms have been changed through evolution into all these interesting different shapes that probably had different functions. So, of course, the best ones are the tail club knob osteoderms at the end of the long, stiff tail, but they also have horns on their skull. They've got big spikes on their shoulders sometimes, or big butt spikes on their bums, and all kinds of little pebbly ossicles all through their skin. So, yeah, they just have this whole sort of suite of bones in their body that most other dinosaurs don't have, which makes them very cool scientifically, and also very challenging to study as well, because those bones usually fall away and it's hard to actually tell where they go on the body. So I certainly like studying them, and I think they're awesome dinosaurs, and I'm glad to hear other people think so as well.
Yeah, so much so that I have not one but two follow-up questions for you.
Ooh.
What is the closest living thing to an ankylosaur?
A bird. So the closest living things to all dinosaurs are birds, because birds are the direct descendants of dinosaurs. They are not the direct descendants of ankylosaurs. So ankylosaurs don't really have any close living relatives that look like them, right? So obviously birds are like bipedal and feathery, and so they look a lot more like their theropod ancestors. In terms of animals that share some traits with ankylosaurs through convergent evolution, you can think about things like armadillos, which also have osteoderms in their skin, which they've evolved separately from ankylosaurs. Turtles actually have osteoderms in their skin, and crocodiles have osteoderms in their skin. So it's actually kind of a cool example of something that might be what we call in science a deep homology. So something where the genetic architecture and mechanisms for growing osteoderms might be shared all the way back to the common ancestor of all these groups, but then that sort of genetic machinery only turns on in certain types of animals. No super close relatives that really look like them. So yeah, if you look at a chicken or a pigeon outside, that is still a relative of an ankylosaur, despite how different it looks.
Awesome, thanks. You mentioned genetics, so let's switch gears a little bit. And we all have seen Jurassic Park. There are several scientific issues with the first movie, one of which is them using frog DNA to fill in the gaps of the dinosaur genetic code. Clearly something like a bird or a crocodilian would have been a closer match to what would have been needed in that scenario. What other sort of scientific inaccuracies are your biggest pet peeves with the Jurassic franchise? And we'll do this alphabetically. So Victoria, you're up first.
My biggest pet peeves. So I'll say that one of the things that I'm actually pretty sympathetic to is the idea that there would be things that show up in a genetically resurrected animal that we wouldn't have expected from the fossil. So that's partly why I like Dilophosaurus. So I actually don't get as fussed about some of those things, or the idea that by mixing and matching we might have unexpected consequences. Where my big pet peeves, honestly, my biggest pet peeve is that ankylosaurs don't get very much to do in the Jurassic Park series. And I guess my biggest pet peeve would be that the tail clubs are not particularly accurate in the Jurassic Park ankylosaurs. So they're very wiggly. An ankylosaur's tail club is actually really unintuitive. So the front part of the tail will wave side to side, but then the back part is very stiff. So it's really like having a sledgehammer at the end of your tail. And so the Jurassic Park ankylosaurus have quite curvy, like scorpion tails, and they kind of just like wiggle their tails around and smash into things. So it's fun to see them using their tails, but it's not particularly accurate. So that is probably my biggest pet peeve there, because they could have gotten that right from the skeletal record.
All right, Riley, same question.
So many to choose from, but I think if I have to pick one, at least for the early movies, it was that most of the dinosaurs that we should be seeing in the park, if they're deriving the genetic information that they're using to do all these things from amber mines around the world, should be dinosaur species that we probably haven't seen before or are entirely new, in that, you know, so many of these familiar animals that we have, we know them from bones, but they don't really coexist with, you know, amber that would preserve the insects that they would need in many of the circumstances. So they retcon this a bit later, and so they can get DNA from bones and stuff as well. But really, I think early on, it would have been fantastic to see them just really run with that idea. So to see a speculative ceratopsid or tyrannosaur or whatever it was. So I think it's the sort of Jurassic Park that we didn't get is one of my pet peeves.
Kimi?
Well, okay. So I mean, there's a few things that are obviously a bit irritating, but I try not to get irritated when I go see these movies, because they're just enjoyable movies. But in the latest one, I guess, because that's the one I saw more recently, there's a few things, like, I don't know, like when they fly over a sauropod that's like wading in water and they're like, Dreadnoughtus. I'm like, how do you know? There's a whole bunch of them that look like quite similar. Like, can you see the lamina on the vertebra that like are going to tell you that it's Dreadnoughtus, not this thing? That's quite, I mean, I don't even think we've figured it out. So that's quite amusing, I guess. And then the other thing is obviously I was very excited by the Lystrosaurus. Because it's cool to see non-dinosaurs. It does create some confusion in that obviously people might think that Dimetrodon and Lystrosaurus are dinosaurs, but like Ashley said and Victoria said, it's a teaching opportunity. But why make Lystrosaurus like carnivorous? Like, why make it chew someone's hand off? Like, come on. Everything has to be super aggressive. Like, it doesn't have to be. Lystrosaurus is like, it's got a beak, it's herbivorous, it's cute. So I guess that was quite annoying.
Ashley?
So one of the things that I know everyone will kind of resonate with is the raptor hands being this way, and I know everyone demonstrate at the same time. So in the movie they were this way, but in real life they actually could not function. That would be a broken wrist in a dinosaur. And I know all of us have had conversations like this. So when you see raptor toys that are like this, that is inaccurate, but they actually would have been able to have their hands like this. So not terribly different. And of course, that is the mechanism that allows birds to fold their wings in. And so that is why I look so ridiculous right now, but that is why raptors have been corrected actually in the latest film. They actually do hold their hands, and the toys actually reflect this as well, which I was thrilled with. My other one is pterosaurs being incredibly aggressive. They definitely wouldn't attack a plane the way that it did in the most recent film. I don't think they would have been as aggressive. If you look at animals today, I mean, geese are aggressive, yes, but it's really hard to get something to attack you from out of the sky, just based on the animals that we have around today. They're usually minding their own business, not caring about anything, and they definitely couldn't pick up people with their feet. That's one of the bigger ones too. So they couldn't grasp like a raptor does today, like a red-tailed hawk. They didn't have that sort of mechanism in their feet. And so it's just very silly when you see them doing those sorts of things in the films.
Holtz?
Okay. I guess it's on me. I think it blanked out a bit for me. Okay, cool. So there's oh so many. One thing I'll add, Kimi's experience with Dreadnoughtus is you scroll back in time was me with Gallimimus. At the time the first movie came out, I was one of maybe 10 people in the world who had probably worked with Gallimimus professionally. And I wouldn't have been able to recognize it. And that was sort of a joke. The explanation, at least for that time, was, well, at least the kid read the brochure, so he knew which ornithomimid they had. So I think one of my main pet peeves has to do with more the Jurassic World trilogy than the first one. And that has to do with tying back to something you talked about earlier, the impact that Jurassic Park made when it first came out. So when that movie came out, it showed the public at large dinosaurs as we scientists were beginning to understand them in the 1980s, here in the mid-90s. So it was the dinosaurs of the 80s portrayed for people of the mid-90s. They finally got to see these cool creatures we were understanding. Then we scroll up to the Jurassic World movies, and we get to introduce to the kids of the 20-teens the dinosaurs of the 1950s. That they missed a real bunch of opportunities. And I know before people complain and put quotes down there, so yes, okay, Wu had quotes. That's okay. In the real world, the movie producers missed a great chance. because it would work in perfectly fine thematically. You know, it's a new park, they've got new technology to show the world how wonderfully weird we now understand dinosaurs to be, and they could still be equally awesome. They've updated that a bit with some of the more recent movies, but you know, so many people out there have real misconceptions of what raptors looked like. I mean, they were murder birds. And had we known about the raptor fossils from northeastern China 100 years ago, we would have just had this idea that raptors are these weird, predatory, early parts of the bird group and not scaly creatures. That doesn't mean that Blue isn't an awesome character. I like Blue. Blue's cool. But they just missed a real chance, I think, to introduce the world to dinosaurs as we now currently understand them.
I'm sorry, can I chime in real quick, Tom? My brain just broke. I have been pronouncing Gallimimus. Am I completely off?
It's fine. Mimus or Mimus, you find people use both. They even do that with the modern mockingbirds, which use that as a word element in their genus name. So it's fine, because we get both mimic and mime, and those are both, you know, words that come from that same root element, so it's fine. Gallimimus, Gallimimus,
and Parasaurolophus.
Exactly.
And
they don't care.
Giganotosaurus versus Giganotosaurus, which is how I had
next one.
a brain melt in the theater.
Gigantosaurus?
Yeah.
Tomato.
Yep.
Evan, same question.
Yeah, so I think I would probably like to piggyback off of what Holtz said. I think one of the things is that with Jurassic World, it's a new park, so you could, of course, update your dinosaurs a little bit. And also, they do have some missing gaps, so you could bring in the aspect of genetic engineering, but I think the Raptor Squad would have been great to be updated, however, and maybe give them a new name besides Velociraptor, like maybe, well, I know the first film had Deinonychus, but Velociraptor just sounded really cool, but you could have introduced, like, maybe reaching to, like, Deinonychus or Utah Raptor, however. And not to mention the colors of the dinosaurs in Jurassic World. They have, like, these very dull gray and green colors. I'm like, they now have very bright ones because before Jurassic World came out, I remember that there was the Jurassic World website, and it featured new dinosaurs with artwork by Julius Chitney, and they had, like, very unique colors. The Suchomimus had little protofeathers on its wrist and on its neck, and I'm like, ooh, this is really nice. And then when I see the trailer in the film, I'm like, oh, they just brought the more familiar ones, and they have, like, the tail dragging appearances and elephant feet. I'm like, oh, wow, that's okay, but it's kind of like, at least with Dominion, they corrected some stuff, like they gave dinosaurs feathers, even though it's not the right kind of feathers, but it's still a start. And some of them are now shown with, like, having their little clapping hands. I like that a lot. My second pet peeve would, of course, be the theropod heads. For some reason, they always, and it's not just Jurassic Park, but the T-Rex is always given, like, the angry brow horns, like a single brow horn. Whereas in real life, and I think you can actually see this in Holtz's background, a T-Rex actually has two bumps over its eye, however. So it kind of shows like it would have been more different. And I get it, they want to make them feel angry, like, I'm angry, I'm mad and all, but I think it probably would be nice to give theropods at least some more accurate looking skulls, however, like just like a single bump or like two bumps over the eye or something.
All excellent points. Switching gears a little bit, the new movie shows a little glimpse as to how illegal trading in actual dinosaur organisms would have happened in that world where dinosaurs coexist with people. But there is a very real fossil trade that happens, both legal and illegal, today. Does anyone want to comment on how both those aspects affect our field?
It's kind of like, how much time do you got? These are big questions. It's difficult, right? Because people love dinosaurs, and many folks want to have them. They want a piece of that prehistory and to touch it. And I know it's very formative, I think, for a lot of folks to have a chunk of dinosaur bone. Like I remember when I was a kid in the late 80s and early 90s, like so many cereal boxes or other things, you can go to a museum, they say this is a verified chunk of dinosaur bone. And meanwhile, that's from like a hadrosaur femur that someone busted up into a million pieces, and we don't get it anymore to sell for a museum. So it's difficult. I don't think that the commercial market is always necessarily harmful for our science. There are a lot of things in the background, the history of our field where these things have been important, and there are ways that we can work with reputable collectors and amateurs and people who want to assist the science. But I think especially in the United States, and this is different around the world, in the United States, this plays so much into issues of land use and who you think that land belongs to and whether the fossils coming out of it should be registered in any sense whatsoever. And that gets into global issues as well. Like even within our field, this isn't just from sort of commercial collectors outside, but there are paleontologists who have assisted in smuggling fossils out of places like Brazil or amber out of Myanmar and things like that. So really, I think there's not so much like a solution at the moment, but as you mentioned, like this dovetails with something real, and it's something that I think as a field that, you know, at least now we're talking about it. We're struggling with it. We're trying to figure it out. There are lots of different opinions, but at least now it's getting more out in the open, sort of like damage this can do to the science and what do we do to remedy this and get everybody to work together.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to remember there have been several cases where people have begun to do the right things, repatriation of fossils to the nations from which they came from, including some really significant fossils, like the various bits and pieces of Dinokairos, where a single individual of this wonderful giant ornithomimosaur gets reassembled back to its proper majesty, or the eggs of Bebe Long, a giant Oviraptorosaur, which were not merely repatriated back to China, but I think even better, repatriated back to the province in which they were recovered rather than to Beijing. So, you know, which is cool museum there, big center for research, but China's a vast country, and it's good for the citizens of all the regions of it to be able to see the fossils coming from their land. So there are people who are doing the right thing. In some cases, when they found out about it, they didn't realize the implications of buying these specimens, who then turn around and say, let's work with the governments, let's work with the museums and get the fossils back to where they should be. Like Indiana Jones says, it belongs in a museum.
And actually dovetailing off of Tom, there are incredible resources these days where if you or your family, or if you're a teacher and you would like fossils for your classroom or just at home to inspire kids, there are plenty of incredible casting companies that make and sell their own casts. So you can get I had a guy come in the other day to Museum of the Rockies and showed me his cast skull of Sue the T-Rex. Or you can get little, claws and teeth these days from different reputable sellers. So if there's any question, of course, I am of the stance that fossils belong in a museum. Of course, that stands for all vertebrate fossils. There's different rules and regulations for invertebrates and plants, of course, but if in doubt, just buy a cast.
Yeah, I too would agree with that. I think it's good that there's now being some more awareness about this, however, especially when you think about like real fossils being lost to science, because I remember how 2 years ago when Stan was sold, and I remembered like that was horrible. That was like one of the best preserved T-Rexes and a really good one in a lot of T-Rex papers. And it was unfortunate, but then we found out that like, oh, Stan's going to be going to a museum. It's going to be in Abu Dhabi. So at least it's good that like there's some people that are now recognizing the significance of real fossils, however, too. So it's kind of something that like we're still trying to figure out and sort, but at least it's like there's now some awareness being spread, however.
If I could just chime in, we've been talking about the sort of commercial trade of fossils, but there's also the illegal trade of fossils, which we touched on. I guess, and I don't know the answer to this, but depending on the country also it varies. But what happens when, let's say, you inherit a fossil from someone in your family and you know that you're not supposed to have it and you know that it's illegal? What do? Do you send it back to the country where it comes from? Are they going to then reprimand you. Like I'm not sure what the rules and regulations are with that, and I don't know if it's clear. Obviously, it's going to differ per country, but I'm sure it happens a lot that people end up with fossils that they don't necessarily want. They want to give them back, and I guess that should be made clear how to go around that too.
Honey, I think you have a new Science on the Street coming up. I think we should delve into an hour about this.
About fossil trading. Yeah. There's a lot here that, we're just touching on and can't really cover in this kind of format, but it is both an aid to our field when we're working with people who understand the value and are willing to work with us to put those fossils in the right places. And it hurts our field when all of these things are traded illegally and we lose track of them and they don't end up in places where they can be easily studied. So it's multifaceted and it's not easily parsed out.
One point I would like to touch on too is that fossils, for anyone watching who's not familiar with this, fossils are a finite resource, so they're not being what was created from the past is now no longer able to be created again. So it is a finite resource. Every tooth, every vertebra, everything is like a one-of-a-kind thing. And so that is why we're also passionate about fossils and fossil poaching and fossil collecting. And I think in Jurassic World, they touched on a really important thing in Dominion. And that is, if dinosaurs were brought back, how would that affect, they were kind of showing them in the pet trade and kind of loose and being traded for their claws and their goods, just like animals are today. And I think it brought up a really real point that hopefully a lot of people will take home, is that poaching of animal parts of any kind these days is still a huge problem. And hopefully it'll bring light to that as well.
Ashley, I think you brought up a point about resources for teachers and for people wanting to have access to these kind of fossils. What are some of the best resources available for the general public who want to learn more about ancient life?
Oh my gosh. I mean, there's so many, and I can probably spout off a few, but my favorite right now is Eons on PBS. It is an incredibly rich video series that has incredible hosts. It is free to watch on YouTube, and the content is just, there's nothing like it out there. So if anyone else wants to chime in.
Yeah, I'll chime in. There are, I guess, one thing that sort of came out of the pandemic is so many museums started to put content online, like webinars or guest lectures or kids activities. So I know, like, my institution, the Royal BC Museum, did a whole series of at-home webinars for adults and kids. But I think one thing I would say is that if you want more information about dinosaurs and you're a parent or an educator, look to your local museums. So there are museums all around you. Even really small museums can have amazing resources for learning about fossils and paleontology, and often learning about the fossils that are in your backyard. So of course everybody likes T-Rex and Tyrannosaurus. We are not all fortunate enough to live in places where you actually can go and find a T-Rex or a Tyrannosaurus, but you might have really cool fossils right at hand. The museums might lead field trips to those sites. They might have displays that you don't even know about. They might have kits that you can take out and sort of borrow, almost like from a library. So yeah, so, figure out what museums are close to you, even if they're really little ones. And that they can, it's not just the big museums that have really great resources on hand. And a small museum will be just as passionate about it as a big museum.
Yeah, and dovetailing with you, Victoria, I know, so I run our virtual programs here and our outreach kits, and we ship statewide. I've even had requests from other states. And when we do our live streams, we reach thousands of people across the world. And so I think one thing that we learned from the pandemic is that we're able to reach people from all over. And so now more than ever, virtual resources are readily accessible. And as a kid, that's really awesome because kids love screens. I know, parents aren't big fans of them, but that's really where a lot of good content lies. And also, of course, your local libraries. So be sure to support the libraries, and they have DVDs and books and movies and computers if you don't have computer access. And I'll let others give theirs too.
Yeah, one thing, and a number of the other panelists contributed to this. In the early days of the pandemic, we started to put together a list of a Google document of online resources, not merely for educators, but for everyone, about paleontology and not just dinosaurs. So I'll share that, and so that could be, linked with the whole presentation. So you can click through and see what's there. It's sort of a living document, so we can continue to add to it. And also, as Ashley mentioned, books. I think a lot of us got hooked on dinosaur books, and a lot of the panelists here are involved with and have written books, not just technical ones, but ones for the public. And we've got multiple languages, actually, in which those books have been published. So go read a good dinosaur book today.
Yeah, I was going to say, you can look any of us up on Amazon. I think we all have a book.
In terms...
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, if I would like to also chime in, there's also been like a couple of museums doing webinars. I know that at the beginning of the pandemic, the Raymond Alp Museum of Paleontology, they started doing Fossil Friday chats. And with it, they mostly highlighted students and also a lot of researchers that have done work in their own field, like say dinosaurs, or maybe even other prehistoric animals too, however, and also scientific outreach as well.
And just to jump in with this, how useful the internet has been in all of this, there are many places that you can go to go see fossils where they are, things relevant to fossils. It sometimes takes a little bit of research to suss it out. But for example, like out here in Utah and Colorado, we have the Dinosaur Diamond, which is a byway system that connects a whole bunch of different museums and track sites and dinosaur-related things. Or if you're in the US anywhere and you type in just KT Boundary, which is the old name, it'll give you directions to that line in the rock 66 million years ago in Trinidad, Colorado. Or there are all sorts of things like in the Midwest, like Ordovician rocks or rocks with marine fossils and things like that in it. So, even if where you're at might not have dinosaur accessible sort of rocks, there's probably something fossiliferous and probably something geologically wonderful in your backyard somewhere. So if you have a look at your states or your areas, state parks, or just do a basic Google search, a lot of climbing groups have tips on this as well. You can find some really fantastic places to really get in touch with these time periods where they're exposed.
And what did you say that was called, Riley? Because we're up here in Montana, we have the Dinosaur Trail. What's yours called?
The Dinosaur Diamond.
Dinosaur Diamond. So you kind of go around.
Yeah, it goes from about Grand Junction in Colorado, sort of out to Salt Lake City through the Moab area. You'll actually see signs on the highways that you're on. They'll say Dinosaur Diamond Byway,
Awesome.
Scenic Route. So you'll know that you're on the right stretch. And it's just so full of different track sites and museums and fossil spots like Cleveland Lloyd. Just so many amazing places to see.
And actually, if you're looking for a road trip, might I suggest if I have it here next to me. Drum roll, please. Here it is. Cruising the Fossil Freeway book. This is my favorite. It's not going to show up because it's being eaten by a T-Rex. There we go. Cruising the Fossil Freeway by Kirk Johnson and Rachel. And you can literally take a fossil road trip with your family or your friends and visit Riley and me across Utah and Montana.
Sort of another thing that came out from the pandemic, and I was back in South Africa at this point in time, but it was quite enjoyable, is all of the virtual tours of museums that sort of came out. I really, really thoroughly enjoyed that, especially in a pandemic when you can't travel and things like that. But also being in South Africa, it's also really nice to be able to take tours of the Field Museum and learn about all the cool things they have there. And I hope that that's something that will keep being updated sort of as time goes on.
All right, so just to wrap up our conversation, what is one discovery you're hoping will be made in like the next decade? And we'll go in reverse alphabetical just to mix it up. So Evan, you're first up.
Hold on. Oh boy, this is a really tough one. A new dinosaur discovery. I guess maybe something on Spinosaurus, because there's always been talks about like, could it swim or something? But I think maybe just like, can we just have like a complete skeleton of Spinosaurus just so we can see what it would have looked like in real life? I know we found just bits and pieces and it just takes a lot of interpretation, but I would love for there to be a complete skeleton of Spinosaurus just so we can like solve it completely.
Holtz?
Okay, so a lake or lagoon deposit from the early Jurassic that has a lot of different species in it so we can know what their integument was like. Because where we pick up these wonderful feathered dinosaurs starts in the middle Jurassic. That's just a few sites. Really much, much better when we get to late Jurassic and the early to mid Cretaceous. But those early days, the late Triassic and the early Jurassic, when the dinosaur radiation is beginning to split apart, what was covering those bodies? Will we find out that Dr. Chapelle's beloved sauropodomorphs were fuzzy? We don't know. That's still potentially in play. We don't know yet. I'm not necessarily betting on it, but we need the positive evidence from those early days. What was on the bodies of the proto-dinosaurs, the Legurpitids and so forth. And we're not going to find that without the right type of rocks.
Ashley?
Okay. Mine has to do with the late Cretaceous, and for anyone watching out there and loves Jurassic Park, we have never in the world found the eggs of Triceratops or of T-Rex. No eggs. We have relatives of them, theropods and ceratopsians, that have eggs and embryos that have been found. No eggs from T-Rex, no eggs from Triceratops. I want that. Let's make that happen.
Kimi?
I'm always a fan of eggs. More eggs is good. I guess mine was going to be sort of piggybacking on Tom Holtz's answer, but also just more about dinosaur colors, right? So we know a bit about feathered dinosaur colors, but we don't know much about the other guys. We have hypotheses, but it would be really nice to be able to get a better idea of sort of the colors and have a better picture painted for us.
Riley?
I think Tom got to my answer before I did. I want to believe in the fuzzy sauropodomorphs. I don't think they're entirely covered in integument per se, but I think they had something, and I really would love to see it. But just to think of an alternate very quickly, kind of relates to the last days of the dinosaurs, sort of the end of the Cretaceous. So much of what we know comes from basically this pinhole. It's a global event, but so much of what we know comes from Western North America, and we really don't know what was going on the other side of the planet, other locations around the planet, because so often we don't have that before and after snapshot of the latest Cretaceous rocks and the earliest Paleocene rocks to compare, like, who survived, who made it through, what did this look like, what is the timing. So I would love to find something, or at least to hear about something that's similar to our, favorite and beloved Hell Creek Formation, somewhere else on the other side of the planet. And we really start to piece together, how did this play out? How did this great dinosaurian saga kind of not come to an end, because birds are still with us, but change fundamentally? That's what I'd love to see.
And finally, Victoria?
I want something I wouldn't expect. So I know that's a cop-out answer kind of, but I just think about the times when I've been most delighted by new papers. There have been two in the last few years. One was the description of Ichi, something that I would, if someone was like, today a paper's gonna get published about a bat-winged feathered dinosaur, I'd be like, what? So like you never wake up thinking something like that's gonna happen. Or last winter, the description of Stegoros, so this early diverging ankylosaur from Antarctica with a tail club independently evolved from the ones that I usually think about, that's actually constructed quite differently. Like, again, it's totally plausible, but if you asked me if I would wake up one day and that would get published, I would not I would be like, I don't think so. So I always like the idea that there's something out there that you can't even imagine necessarily or really anticipate coming. So I hope that we continue to have cool things like that, because it's very humbling to realize that you haven't even thought to ask the question necessarily yet about some of these things. A close second would be a hairy ankylosaur. So not very likely, but maybe those two desires of mine will converge at some point. So
I'll add my own to this one. So early avialin, three-dimensionally preserved brain case. Because we don't have those. All of the ones we have are flat, and that doesn't make studying brains easy. So if we had one in 3 dimensions, that would be ideal, but we don't yet, so hopefully one of those.
It sounds like someone needs to go find that Jurassic logger stuff for y'all.
Very badly, yeah. Well, thank you to all of my panelists for joining us on Science on the Street today, and we'll see you all next time.